A Christmas Guest. One of those who had lived the life of a pensioner at Ekeby was little Ruster, who could transpose music and play the flute. He was of low origin and poor, without home and without relations. Hard times came to him when the company of pensioners were dispersed. He then had no horse, no carriole, no fur coat, nor red-painted luncheon basket. He had to go on foot from house to house and carry his belongings tied in a blue striped cotton handkerchief. He buttoned his coat all the way up to his chin, so that no one should need to know in what condition his shirt and waistcoat were. And in his deep pockets he kept his most precious possessions: his flute, taken to pieces, his flat brandy bottle, and his music pen. His profession was to copy music, and if it had been as in the old days, there would have been no lack of work for him. But with every passing year, music was less practiced in Värmland. The guitar, with its mouldy silken ribbon and its worn screws, and the dented horn with faded tassels and cord, were put away in the lumber room in the attic. And the dust settled inches deep on the long iron-bound violin boxes. Yet the less little Ruster had to do with flute and music pen, so much more, the more must he return to the brandy flask, and at last he became quite a drunkard. It was a great pity. He was still received at the manor houses as an old friend, but there were complaints when he came and joy when he went. There was an odor of dirt and brandy about him, and if he had only a couple of glasses of wine or one toddy, he grew confused and told unpleasant stories. He was the torment of the hospitable houses. One Christmas he came to Lövdala, where Liljekrona, the great violinist, had his home. Liljekrona had also been one of the pensioners of Ekeby, but after the death of the major's wife, he returned to his quiet farm and remained there. Ruster came to him a few days before Christmas, in the midst of all the preparations, and asked for work. Liljekrona gave him a little copying to keep him busy. "You ought to have let him go immediately," said his wife. "Now he will certainly take so long with that we will be obliged to keep him over Christmas." "He must be somewhere," answered Liljekrona. And he offered Ruster toddy and brandy, sat with him, and lived over again with him the whole Ekeby time. But he was out of spirits and disgusted by him, like everyone else, although he would not let it be seen, for old friendship and hospitality were sacred to him. In Liljekrona's house, for 3 weeks now, they had been preparing to receive Christmas. They had been living in discomfort and bustle, had set up with dip lights and torches till their eyes grew red, had been frozen in the outhouse with the salting of meat, and in the brew house with the brewing of the beer. But both the mistress and the servants gave themselves up to it all without grumbling. When all the preparations were done and the holy evening come, a sweet enchantment would sink down over them. Christmas would loosen all tongues, so that jokes and jests, rhymes and merriment would flow of themselves without effort. Everyone's feet would wish to twirl in the dance, and from memory's dark corners words and melodies would rise, although no one could believe that they were there. And then everyone was so good, so good. Now, when Ruster came, the whole household at Lövdala thought that Christmas was spoiled. The mistress and the older children and the old servants were all of the same opinion. Ruster caused them a suffocating disgust. They were moreover afraid that when he and Liljekrona began to rake up the old memories, the artist's blood would flame up in the great violinist, and his home would lose him. Formerly he had not been able to remain long at home. No one can describe how they loved their master on the farm, since they had had him with them a couple of years. And what he had to give, how much he was to his home, especially at Christmas. He did not take his place of any sofa or rocking stool, but on a high, narrow wooden bench in the corner of the fireplace. When he had settled there, he started off on adventures. He traveled about the earth, climbed up to the stars and even higher. He played and talked by turns, and the whole household gathered about him and listened. Life grew proud and beautiful when the richness of that one soul shone on it. Therefore they loved him as they loved Christmas time. Pleasure, the spring sun, and when little Ruster came, their Christmas peace was destroyed. They had worked in vain if he was coming to tempt away their master. It was unjust that the drunkard should sit at the Christmas table in a happy house and spoil the Christmas pleasure. On the forenoon of Christmas Eve, little Ruster had his music written out, and he said something about going, although of course he meant to stay. Liljekrona had been influenced by the general feeling, and therefore said quite lukewarmly and indifferently that Ruster had better stay where he was over Christmas. Little Ruster was inflammable and proud. He twirled his moustache and shook back the black artist's hair that stood like a dark cloud over his head. What did Liljekrona mean? Should he stay because he had nowhere else to go? Oh, only think how they stood and waited for him in the big ironworks in the parish of Bro. The guest room was in order, the glass of welcome filled. He was in great haste. He only did not know to which he ought to go first. Very well, answered Liljekrona. You may go if you will. After dinner, little Ruster borrowed horse and sleigh, coat and furs. The stable boy from Lövdala was to take him to some place in Bro and drive quickly back, for it threatened snow. No one believed that he was expected, or that there was a single place in the neighborhood where he was welcome. But they were so anxious to be rid of him that they put the thought aside and let him depart. He wished it himself, they said, and then they thought that now they would be glad. But when they gathered in the dining room at 5 o'clock to drink tea and to dance round the Christmas tree, Liljekrona was silent and out of spirits. He did not seat himself on the bench. He touched neither tea nor punch. He could not remember any polka. The violin was out of order. Those who could play and dance had to do it without him. Then his wife grew uneasy. The children were discontented. Everything in the house went wrong. It was the most lamentable Christmas Eve. The porridge turned sour, the candles sputtered, the wood smoked, the wind stirred up the snow and blew bitter cold into the rooms. The stable boy who had driven Ruster did not come home. The cook wept, the maids scolded. Finally, Liljekrona remembered that no sheaves had been put out for the sparrows, and he complained aloud of all the women about him who abandoned old customs and were new-fangled and heartless. They understood well enough that what tormented him was remorse that he had let little Ruster go away from his home on Christmas Eve. After a while he went to his room, shut the door, and began to play as he had not played since he had ceased roaming. It was full of hate and scorn, full of longing and revolt. You thought to bind me, but you must forge new fetters. You thought to make me as small-minded as yourselves, but I turn to larger things, to the open. Commonplace people, slaves of the home, hold me prisoner if it is in your power. When his wife heard the music, she said, "Tomorrow he is gone, if God does not work a miracle in the night. Our inhospitableness has brought on just what we thought we could avoid." In the meantime, little Ruster drove about in the snowstorm. He went from one house to the other and asked if there was any work for him to do, but he was not received anywhere. They did not even ask him to get out of the sledge. Some had their houses full of guests, others were going away on Christmas Day. Drive to the next neighbor, they all said. He could come and spoil the pleasure of an ordinary day, but not of Christmas Eve. Christmas Eve came but once a year, and the children had been rejoicing in the thought of it all the autumn. They could not put that man at a table where there were children. Formerly they had been glad to see him, but not since he had become a drunkard. Where should they put the fellow? Moreover, the servants' room was too plain and the guest room too fine. So little Ruster had to drive from house to house in the blinding snow. His wet moustache hung limply down over his mouth. His eyes were bloodshot and blurred, but the brandy was blown out of his brain. He began to wonder and to be amazed. Was it possible? Was it possible that no one wished to receive him? Then all at once he saw himself. He saw how miserable and degraded he was, and he understood that he was odious to people. It is the end of me, he thought. No more copying of music, no more flute playing. No one on earth needs me. No one has compassion on me. The storm whirled and played, tore apart the drifts and piled them up again, took a pillar of snow in its arms and danced out into the plain, lifted one flake up to the clouds and chased another down into a ditch. It is so, said little Ruster. While one dances and whirls, it is play, but when must be buried in the drift and forgotten, it is sorrow and grief. But down they all have to go, and now it was his turn. To think that he had now come to the end. He no longer asked where the man was driving him. He thought that he was driving in the land of death. Little Ruster made no offerings to the gods that night. He did not curse flute playing or the life of a pensioner. He did not think that it had been better for him if he had ploughed the earth or sewn shoes. But he mourned that he was now a worn-out instrument, which pleasure could no longer use. He complained of no one, for he knew that when the horn is cracked and the guitar will not stay in tune, they must go. He became all at once a very humble man. He understood that it was the end of him on this Christmas Eve. Hunger and cold would destroy him, for he understood nothing, was good for nothing, and had no friends. The sledge stops, and suddenly it is light about him, and he hears friendly voices, and there is someone who is helping him into a warm room, and someone who is pouring warm tea into him. His coat is pulled off him, and several people cry that he is welcome, and warm hands rub life into his benumbed fingers. He was so confused by it all that he did not come to his senses for nearly a quarter of an hour. He could not possibly comprehend that he had come back to Lövdala, that he had not been at all conscious that the stable boy had grown tired of driving about in the storm and had turned home. Nor did he understand why he was now so well received in Liljekrona's house. He could not know that Liljekrona's wife understood what a weary journey he had made that Christmas Eve, when he had been turned away from every door where he had knocked. She felt such compassion on him that she forgot her own troubles. Liljekrona went on with the wild playing up in his room. He did not know that Ruster had come. The latter sat meanwhile in the dining room with the wife and the children. The servants, who used also to be there on Christmas Eve, had moved out into the kitchen away from their mistress's trouble. The mistress of the house lost no time in setting Ruster to work. "You hear, I suppose," she said, "that Liljekrona does nothing but play all the evening, and I must attend to setting the table and the food. The children are quite forsaken. You must look after these two smallest." children were the kind of people with whom little Ruster had had least intercourse. He had met them neither in the bachelor's wing, nor in the campaign tent, neither in wayside inns, nor on the highways. He was almost shy of them, and did not know what he ought to say that was fine enough for them. He took out his flute and taught them how to finger the stops and holes. There was one of 4 years and one of 6. They had a lesson on the flute and were deeply interested in it. "This is A," he said, "and this is C." And then he blew the notes. Then the young people wished to know what kind of an A and C it was that was to be played. Ruster took out his score and made a few notes. "No," they said, "that is not right," and they ran away for an ABC book. Little Ruster began to hear their alphabet. They knew it and they did not know it. What they knew was not very much. Ruster grew eager. He lifted the little boys up, each one on his knees, and began to teach them. Liljekrona's wife went out and in and listened quite in amazement. It sounded like a game, and the children were laughing the whole time, but they learned. Ruster kept on for a while, but he was absent from what he was doing. He was turning over the old thoughts from out in the storm. It was good and pleasant, but nevertheless it was the end of him. He was worn out. He ought to be thrown away. And all of a sudden he put his hands before his face and began to weep. Liljekrona's wife came quickly up to him. "Ruster," she said, "I can understand you to think that all is over for you. You cannot make a living with your music, and you are destroying yourself with brandy. But it is not the end, Ruster." "Yes," sobbed the little flute player. "Do you see that to sit as tonight with the children, that would be something for you? If you would teach children to read and write, you would be welcomed everywhere. That is no less important an instrument on which to play, Ruster, than flute and violin. Look at them, Ruster." She placed the 2 children in front of him, and he looked up, blinking as if he had looked at the sun. It seemed as if his little blurred eyes could not meet those of the children, which were big, clear, and innocent. "Look at them, Ruster," repeated Liljekrona's wife. "I dare not," said Ruster, for it was like a purgatory to look through the beautiful child eyes to the unspotted beauty of their souls. Liljekrona's wife laughed loud and joyously. "Then you must accustom yourself to them, Ruster. You can stay in my house as schoolmaster this year." Liljekrona heard his wife laugh and came out of his room. "What is it?" he said. "What is it?" "Nothing," she answered, "but that Ruster has come again, and that I have engaged him as schoolmaster for our little boys." Liljekrona was quite amazed. "Do you dare?" he said. "Do you dare? Has he promised to give up?" "No," said the wife. "Ruster has promised nothing, but there is much about which he must be careful when he has to look little children in the eyes every day. If it had not been Christmas, perhaps I would not have ventured. But when our Lord dared to place a little child who was his own son among us sinners, so can I also dare to let my little children try to save a human soul." Liljekrona could not speak, but every feature and wrinkle in his face twitched and twisted as always when he heard anything noble. Then he kissed his wife's hand as gently as a child who asks for forgiveness, and cried aloud, "All the children must come and kiss their mother's hand." They did so, and then they had a happy Christmas in Liljekrona's house. Robber Mother, who lived in Robber's Cave up in Göinge forest, went down to the village one day on a begging tour.
Robber Father, who was an outlawed man, did not dare to leave the forest, but had to content himself with lying in wait for the wayfarers who ventured within its borders. But at that time travelers were not very plentiful in southern Skåne. If it so happened that the man had had a few weeks of ill luck with his hunt, his wife would take to the road. She took with her 5 youngsters, and each youngster wore a ragged leathern suit and birch bark shoes, and bore a sack on his back as long as himself. When Robber Mother stepped inside the door of a cabin, no one dared refuse to give her whatever she demanded, for she was not above coming back the following night and setting fire to the house, if she had not been well received. Robber Mother and her brood were worse than a pack of wolves, and many a man felt like running a spear through them. But it was never done, because they all knew that the man stayed up in the forest, and he would have known how to wreak vengeance if anything had happened to the children or the old woman. Now that Robber Mother went from house to house and begged, she came one day to Övid, which at that time was a cloister. She rang the bell of the cloister gate and asked for food. The watchman let down a small wicket in the gate and handed her 6 round bread cakes, 1 for herself and 1 for each of the 5 children. While the mother was standing quietly at the gate, her youngsters were running about, and now one of them came and pulled at her skirt as a signal that he had discovered something which he ought to come and see, and Robber Mother followed him promptly. The entire cloister was surrounded by a high and strong wall, but the youngster had managed to find a little back gate which stood ajar. When Robber Mother got there, she pushed the gate open and walked inside without asking leave, as it was her custom to do. Övid cloister was managed at that time by Abbot Hans, who knew all about herbs. Just within the cloister wall he had planted a little herb garden, and it was into this that the old woman had forced her way. At first glance Robber Mother was so astonished that she paused at the gate. It was high summertide, and Abbot Hans' garden was so full of flowers that the eyes were fairly dazzled by the blues, reds, and yellows as one looked into it. But presently an indulgent smile spread over her features, and she started to walk up a narrow path that lay between many flower beds. In the garden a lay brother walked about, pulling up weeds. It was he who had left the door in the wall open, that he might throw the weeds and tares on the rubbish heap outside. When he saw Robber Mother coming in, with all 5 youngsters in tow, he ran toward her at once and ordered them away. But the beggar woman walked right on as before. She cast her eyes up and down, looking now at the stiff white lilies which spread near the ground, then on the ivy climbing high upon the cloister wall, and took no notice whatever of the lay brother. He thought she had not understood him, and wanted to take her by the arm and turn her toward the gate. But when the robber woman saw his purpose, she gave him a look that sent him reeling backward. She had been walking with back bent under her beggar's pack, but now she straightened herself to her full height. "I am Robber Mother from Göinge forest, so touch me if you dare." And it was obvious that she was as certain she would be left in peace as if she had announced that she was the Queen of Denmark. And yet the lay brother dared to oppose her, although now when he knew who she was, he spoke reasonably to her. "You must know, Robber Mother, that this is a monk's cloister, and no woman in the land is allowed within these walls. If you do not go away, the monks will be angry with me because I forgot to close the gate, and perhaps they will drive me away from the cloister and the herb garden." But such prayers were wasted on Robber Mother. She walked straight ahead among the little flower beds, and looked at the hyssop with its magenta blossoms, and the honeysuckles, which were full of deep orange-colored flower clusters. Then the lay brother knew of no other remedy than to run into the cloister and call for help. He returned with 2 stalwart monks, and Robber Mother saw that now it meant business. With feet firmly planted, she stood in the path and began shrieking in strident tones all the awful vengeance she would wreak on the cloister if she couldn't remain in the herb garden as long as she wished. But the monks did not see why they need fear her, and thought only of driving her out. Then Robber Mother let out a perfect volley of shrieks, and, throwing herself upon the monks, clawed and bit at them. So did all the youngsters. The men soon learned that she could overpower them, and all they could do was to go back into the cloister for reinforcements. As they ran through the passageway which led to the cloister, they met Abbot Hans, who came rushing out to learn what all the noise was about. Then they had to confess that Robber Mother from Göinge forest had come into the cloister, and that they were unable to drive her out and must call for assistance. But Abbot Hans upbraided them for using force, and forbade their calling for help. He sent both monks back to their work, and although he was an old and fragile man, he took with him only the lay brother. When Abbot Hans came out in the garden, Robber Mother was still wandering about the flower beds. He regarded her with astonishment. He was certain that Robber Mother had never before seen a herb garden, yet she sauntered leisurely between all the small patches, each of which had been planted with its own species of rare flower, and looked at them as if they were old acquaintances. At some she smiled, at others she shook her head. Abbot Hans loved his herb garden as much as it was possible for him to love anything earthly and perishable. Wild and terrible as the old woman looked, he couldn't help liking that she had fought with 3 monks for the privilege of viewing the garden in peace. He came up to her and asked in a mild tone if the garden pleased her. Robber Mother turned defiantly toward Abbot Hans, for she expected only to be trapped and overpowered. But when she noticed his white hair and bent form, she answered peaceably, "First, when I saw this, I thought I had never seen a prettier garden, but now I see that it can't be compared with one I know of." Abbot Hans had certainly expected a different answer. When he heard that Robber Mother had seen a garden more beautiful than his, a faint flush spread over his withered cheek. The lay brother, who was standing close by, immediately began to censure the old woman. "This is Abbot Hans," said he, "who with much care and diligence has gathered the flowers from far and near for his herb garden. We all know that there is not a more beautiful garden to be found in all Skåne, and it is not befitting that you, who live in the wild forest all the year around, should find fault with his work." "I don't wish to make myself judge of either him or you," said Robber Mother. "I'm only saying that if you could see the garden of which I'm thinking, you would uproot all the flowers planted here and cast them away like weeds." But the abbot's assistant was hardly less proud of the flowers than the abbot himself, and after hearing her remarks, he laughed derisively. "I can understand that you only talk like this to tease us. It must be a pretty garden that you have made for yourself amongst the pines in Göinge forest. I'd be willing to wager my soul's salvation that you have never before been within the walls of a herb garden." Robber Mother grew crimson with rage to think that her word was doubted, and she cried out, "It may be true that until today I had never been within the walls of a herb garden, but you monks, who are holy men, certainly must know that on every Christmas Eve the great Göinge forest is transformed into a beautiful garden to commemorate the hour of our Lord's birth. We who live in the forest have seen this happen every year. And in that garden I have seen flowers so lovely that I dared not lift my hand to pluck them." The lay brother wanted to continue the argument, but Abbot Hans gave him a sign to be silent. For ever since his childhood, Abbot Hans had heard it said that on every Christmas Eve the forest was dressed in holiday glory. He had often longed to see it, but he had never had the good fortune. Eagerly he begged and implored Robber Mother that he might come up to the robber's cave on Christmas Eve. If she would only send one of her children to show him the way, he could ride up there alone, and he would never betray them. On the contrary, he would reward them in so far as it lay in his power. Robber Mother said no at first, for she was thinking of Robber Father and of the peril which might befall him should she permit Abbot Hans to ride up to their cave. At the same time, the desire to prove to the monk that the garden which she knew was more beautiful than his got the better of her, and she gave in. "But more than one follower you cannot take with you," said she, "and you are not to waylay us or trap us, as sure as you are a holy man." This Abbot Hans promised, and then Robber Mother went her way. Abbot Hans commanded the lay brother not to reveal to a soul that which had been agreed upon. He feared that the monks, should they learn of his purpose, would not allow a man of his years to go up to the robber's cave. Nor did he himself intend to reveal his project to a human being. And then it happened that Archbishop Absalon from Lund came to Övid and remained through the night. When Abbot Hans was showing him the herb garden, he got to thinking of Robber Mother's visit, and the lay brother who was at work in the garden heard Abbot Hans telling the bishop about Robber Father, who these many years had lived as an outlaw in the forest, and asking him for a letter of ransom for the man, that he might lead an honest life among respectable folk. "As things are now," said Abbot Hans, "his children are growing up into worse malefactors than himself, and you will soon have a whole gang of robbers to deal with up there in the forest." But the Archbishop replied that he did not care to let the robber loose among honest folk in the villages. It would be best for all that he remain in the forest. Then Abbot Hans grew zealous and told the bishop all about Göinge forest, which every year at Yuletide clothed itself in summer bloom around the robber's cave. "If these bandits are not so bad, but that God's glories can be made manifest to them, surely we cannot be too wicked to experience the same blessing." The Archbishop knew how to answer Abbot Hans. "This much I will promise you, Abbot Hans," he said, smiling, "that any day you send me a blossom from the garden in Göinge forest, I will give you letters of ransom for all the outlaws you may choose to plead for." The lay brother apprehended that Bishop Absalon believed as little in this story of Robber Mothers as he himself. But Abbot Hans perceived nothing of the sort, but thanked Absalon for his good promise, and said that he would surely send him the flower. Abbot Hans had his way, and the following Christmas Eve he did not sit at home with his monks in Övid cloister, but was on his way to Göinge forest. One of Robber Mother's wild youngsters ran ahead of him, and close behind him was the lay brother, who had talked with Robber Mother in the herb garden. Abbot Hans had been longing to make this journey, and he was very happy now that it had come to pass. But it was a different matter with the lay brother who accompanied him. Abbot Hans was very dear to him, and he would not willingly have allowed another to attend to him and watch over him, but he didn't believe that he should see any Christmas Eve garden. He thought the whole thing a snare which Robber Mother had with great cunning laid for Abbot Hans, that he might fall into her husband's clutches. While Abbot Hans was riding toward the forest, he saw that everywhere they were preparing to celebrate Christmas. In every peasant settlement fires were lighted in the bathhouse to warm it for the afternoon bathing. Great hunks of meat and bread were being carried from the larders into the cabins, and from the barns came the men with big sheaves of straw to be strewn over the floors. As he rode by the little country churches, he observed that each parson, with his sexton, was busily engaged in decorating his church, and when he came to the road which led to Bosjö cloister, he observed that all the poor of the parish were coming with armfuls of bread and long candles, which they had received at the cloister gate. When Abbot Hans saw all these Christmas preparations, his haste increased. He was thinking of the festivities that awaited him, which were greater than any the others would be privileged to enjoy. But the lay brother whined and fretted when he saw how they were preparing to celebrate Christmas in every humble cottage. He grew more and more anxious, and begged and implored Abbot Hans to turn back and not to throw himself deliberately into the robbers' hands. Abbot Hans went straight ahead, paying no heed to his lamentations. He left the plain behind him and came up into desolate and wild forest regions. Here the road was bad, almost like a stony and burr-strewn path, with neither bridge nor plank to help them over brooklet and rivulet. The farther they rode, the colder it grew, and after a while they came upon snow-covered ground. It turned out to be a long and hazardous ride through the forest. They climbed steep and slippery side paths, crawled over swamp and marsh, and pushed through windfall and bramble. Just as daylight was waning, the robber boy guided them across a forest meadow, skirted by tall, naked leaf trees and green fir trees. Back of the meadow loomed a mountain wall, and in this wall they saw a door of thick boards. Now Abbot Hans understood that they had arrived, and dismounted. The child opened the heavy door for him, and he looked into a poor mountain grotto with bare stone walls. Robber Mother was seated before a log fire that burned in the middle of the floor. Alongside the walls were beds of virgin pine and moss, and on one of these beds lay Robber Father asleep. "Come in, you out there," shouted Robber Mother without rising, "and fetch the horses in with you, so they won't be destroyed by the night cold." Abbot Hans walked boldly into the cave, and the lay brother followed. Here were wretchedness and poverty, and nothing was done to celebrate Christmas. Robber Mother had neither brewed nor baked. She had neither washed nor scoured. The youngsters were lying on the floor around a kettle eating, but no better food was provided for them than a watery gruel. Robber Mother spoke in a tone as haughty and dictatorial as any well-to-do peasant woman. "Sit down by the fire and warm yourself, Abbot Hans," said she, "and if you have food with you, eat, for the food which we in the forest prepare you wouldn't care to taste. And if you are tired after the long journey, you can lie down on one of these beds to sleep. You needn't be afraid of oversleeping, for I'm sitting here by the fire keeping watch. I shall awaken you in time to see that which you have come up here to see." Abbot Hans obeyed Robber Mother and brought forth his food sack, but he was so fatigued after the journey he was hardly able to eat, and as soon as he could stretch himself on the bed, he fell asleep. The lay brother was also assigned a bed to rest upon, but he didn't dare sleep, as he thought he had better keep his eye on Robber Father to prevent his getting up and capturing Abbot Hans. But gradually fatigue got the better of him too, and he dropped into a doze. When he woke up, he saw that Abbot Hans had left his bed and was sitting by the fire talking with Robber Mother. The outlawed robber sat also by the fire. He was a tall, raw-boned man with a dull, sluggish appearance. His back was turned to Abbot Hans, as though he would have it appear that he was not listening to the conversation. Abbot Hans was telling Robber Mother all about the Christmas preparations he had seen on the journey, reminding her of Christmas feasts and games which she must have known in her youth when she lived at peace with mankind. "I'm sorry for your children who can never run on the village street in holiday dress or tumble in the Christmas straw," said he. At first Robber Mother answered in short, gruff sentences, but by degrees she became more subdued and listened more intently. Suddenly Robber Father turned toward Abbot Hans and shook his clenched fist in his face. "You miserable monk, did you come here to coax from me my wife and children? Don't you know that I am an outlaw and may not leave the forest?" Abbot Hans looked him fearlessly in the eyes. "It is my purpose to get a letter of ransom for you from Archbishop Absalon," said he. He had hardly finished speaking when the robber and his wife burst out laughing. They knew well enough the kind of mercy a forest robber could expect from Bishop Absalon. "Oh, if I get a letter of ransom from Absalon," said Robber Father, "then I'll promise you that never again will I steal so much as a goose." The lay brother was annoyed with the robber folk for daring to laugh at Abbot Hans, but on his own account he was well pleased. He had seldom seen the abbot sitting more peaceful and meek with his monks at Övid than he now sat with this wild robber folk. Suddenly Robber Mother rose. "You sit here and talk, Abbot Hans," she said, "so that we are forgetting to look at the forest. Now I can hear even in this cave how the Christmas bells are ringing." The words were barely uttered when they all sprang up and rushed out. But in the forest it was still dark night and bleak winter. The only thing they marked was a distant clang borne on a light south wind. "How can this bell ringing ever awaken the dead forest?" thought Abbot Hans. For now, as he stood out in the winter darkness, he thought it far more impossible that a summer garden could spring up here than it had seemed to him before. When the bells had been ringing a few moments, a sudden illumination penetrated the forest. The next moment it was dark again, and then the light came back. It pushed its way forward between the stark trees like a shimmering mist. This much it effected. The darkness merged into a faint daybreak. Then Abbot Hans saw that the snow had vanished from the ground as if someone had removed a carpet, and the earth began to take on a green covering. Then the ferns shot up their fronds, rolled like a bishop's staff. The heather that grew on the stony hills and the bog myrtle rooted in the ground moss dressed themselves quickly in new bloom. The moss tufts thickened and raised themselves, and the spring blossoms shot upwards their swelling buds, which already had a touch of color. Abbot Hans' heart beat fast as he marked the first signs of the forest awakening. "Old man that I am, shall I behold such a miracle?" thought he, and the tears wanted to spring to his eyes. Again it grew so hazy that he feared the darkness would once more cover the earth. But almost immediately there came a new wave of light. It brought with it the splash of rivulet and the rush of cataract. Then the leaves of the trees burst into bloom, as if a swarm of green butterflies came flying and clustered on the branches. It was not only trees and plants that awoke, but grosbeaks hopped from branch to branch, and the woodpeckers hammered on the limbs until the splinters fairly flew around them. A flock of starlings from up country lighted in a fir top to rest. They were paradise starlings. The tips of each tiny feather shone in brilliant reds, and as the birds moved they glittered like so many jewels. Again all was dark for an instant, but soon there came a new light wave. A fresh warm south wind blew and scattered over the forest meadow all the little seeds that had been brought here from southern lands by birds and ships and winds. and which could not thrive elsewhere because of this country's cruel cold. These took root and sprang up the instant they touched the ground. When the next warm wind came along, the blueberries and lignon ripened, cranes and wild geese shrieked in the air, the bullfinches built nests, and the baby squirrels began playing on the branches of the trees. Everything came so fast now that Abbot Hans could not stop to reflect on how immeasurably great was the miracle that was taking place. He had time only to use his eyes and ears. The next light waves that came rushing in brought with it the scent of newly plowed acres, and far off in the distance the milkmaids were heard coaxing the cows, and the tinkle of the sheep's bells. Pine and spruce trees were so thickly clothed with red cones that they shone like crimson mantles. The juniper berries changed color every second, and forest flowers covered the ground till it was all red, blue, and yellow. Abbot Hans bent down to the earth and broke off a wild strawberry blossom, and as he straightened up, the berry ripened in his hand. The mother fox came out of her lair with a big litter of black-legged young. She went up to Robber Mother and scratched at her skirt, and Robber Mother bent down to her and praised her young. The horned owl, who had just begun his night chase, was astonished at the light and went back to his ravine to perch for the night. The male cuckoo crowed, and his mate stole up to the nests of the little birds with her egg in her mouth. Robber Mother's youngsters let out perfect shrieks of delight. They stuffed themselves with wild strawberries that hung on the bushes, large as pine cones. One of them played with a litter of young hares. Another ran a race with some young crows, which had hopped from their nest before they were really ready. A third caught up an adder from the ground and wound it around his neck and arm. Robber Father was standing out on a marsh eating raspberries. When he glanced up, a big black bear stood beside him. Robber Father broke off an oyster twig and struck the bear on the nose. "Keep to your own ground, you," he said. "This is my turf." Then the huge bear turned around and lumbered off in another direction. New waves of warmth and light kept coming, and now they brought with them seeds from the starflower. Golden pollen from rye fields fairly flew in the air. Then came butterflies so big that they looked like flying lilies. The beehive in a hollow oak was already so full of honey that it dripped down on the trunk of the tree. Then all the flowers whose seeds had been brought from foreign lands began to blossom. The loveliest roses climbed up the mountain wall in a race with the blackberry vines, and from the forest meadow sprang flowers as large as human faces. Abbot Hans thought of the flower he was to pluck for Bishop Absalom, but each new flower that appeared was more beautiful than the others, and he wanted to choose the most beautiful of all. Wave upon wave kept coming until the air was so filled with light that it glittered. All the life and beauty and joy of summer smiled on Abbot Hans. He felt that earth could bring no greater happiness than that which welled up about him, and he said to himself, "I do not know what new beauties the next wave that comes can bring with it." But the light kept streaming in, and now it seemed to Abbot Hans that it carried with it something from an infinite distance. He felt a celestial atmosphere enfolding him, and tremblingly he began to anticipate. Now that earth's joys had come, the glories of heaven were approaching. Then Abbot Hans marked how all grew still. The birds hushed their songs, the flowers ceased growing, and the young foxes played no more. The glory now nearing was such that the heart wanted to stop beating. The eyes wept without once knowing it. The soul longed to soar away into the eternal. From far in the distance faint harp tones were heard, and celestial song like a soft murmur reached him. Abbot Hans clasped his hands and dropped to his knees. His face was radiant with bliss. Never had he dreamt that even in this life it should be granted him to taste the joys of heaven and to hear angels sing Christmas carols. But beside Abbot Hans stood the lay brother who had accompanied him. In his mind there were dark thoughts. This cannot be a true miracle, he thought, since it is revealed to malefactors. This does not come from God, but has its origin in witchcraft, and is sent hither by Satan. It is the evil one's power that is tempting us and compelling us to see that which has no real existence. From afar were heard the sound of angel harps and the tones of a miserere, but the lay brother thought it was the evil spirits of hell coming closer. They would enchant and seduce us, sighed he, and we shall be sold into perdition. The angel throng was so near now that Abbot Hans saw their bright forms through the forest branches. The lay brother saw them too, but back of all this wondrous beauty he saw only some dread evil. For him it was the devil who performed these wonders on the anniversary of our Saviour's birth. It was done simply for the purpose of more effectually deluding poor human beings. All the while the birds had been circling around the head of Abbot Hans, and they let him take them in his hands. But all the animals were afraid of the lay brother. No bird perched on his shoulder, no snake played at his feet. Then there came a little forest dove. When she marked that the angels were nearing, she plucked up courage and flew down on the lay brother's shoulder and laid her head against his cheek. Then it appeared to him as if sorcery were come right upon him, to tempt and corrupt him. He struck with his hand at the forest dove, and cried in such a loud voice that it rang throughout the forest, "Go thou back to hell, whence thou art come." Just then the angels were so near that Abbot Hans felt the feathery touch of their great wings, and he bowed down to earth in reverent greeting. But when the lay brothers' words sounded, their song was hushed, and the holy guests turned in flight. At the same time the light and the mild warmth vanished in unspeakable terror for the darkness and cold in a human heart. Darkness sank over the earth like a coverlet. Frost came. All the growths shriveled up. The animals and birds hastened away. The rushing of streams was hushed. The leaves dropped from the trees, rustling like rain. Abbot Hans felt how his heart, which had but lately swelled with bliss, was now contracting with insufferable agony. "I can never outlive this," thought he, "that the angels from heaven had been so close to me and were driven away, that they wanted to sing Christmas carols for me and were driven to flight." Then he remembered the flower he had promised Bishop Absalon, and at the last moment he fumbled among the leaves and moss to try and find a blossom. But he sensed how the ground under his fingers froze, and how the white snow came gliding over the ground. Then his heart caused him even greater anguish. He could not rise, but fell prostrate on the ground and lay there. When the robber folk and the lay brother had groped their way back to the cave, they missed Abbot Hans. They took brands with them and went out to search for him. They found him dead upon the coverlet of snow. Then the lay brother began weeping and lamenting, for he understood that it was he who had killed Abbot Hans, because he had dashed from him the cup of happiness which he had been thirsting to drain to its last drop. When Abbot Hans had been carried down to Övid, those who took charge of the dead saw that he held his right hand locked tight around something which he must have grasped at the moment of death. When they finally got his hand open, they found that the thing which he had held in such an iron grip was a pair of white root bulbs which he had torn from among the moss and leaves. When the lay brother who had accompanied Abbot Hans saw the bulbs, he took them and planted them in Abbot Hans' herb garden. He guarded them the whole year to see if any flower would spring from them, but in vain he waited through the spring, the summer, and the autumn. Finally, when winter had set in, and all the leaves and the flowers were dead, he ceased caring for them. But when Christmas Eve came again, he was so strongly reminded of Abbot Hans that he wandered out into the garden to think of him. And look! As he came to the spot where he had planted the bare root bulbs, he saw that from them had sprung flourishing green stalks, which bore beautiful flowers with silver white leaves. He called out all the monks at Övid, and when they saw that this plant bloomed on Christmas Eve, when all the other growth were as if dead, they understood that this flower had in truth been plucked by Abbot Hans from the Christmas garden in Göinge forest. Then the lay brother asked the monks if he might take a few blossoms to Bishop Absalon. And when he appeared before Bishop Absalon, he gave him the flowers and said, "Abbot Hans sent you these. They are the flowers he promised to pick for you from the garden in Göinge forest." When Bishop Absalon beheld the flowers which had sprung from the earth in darkest winter, and heard the words, he turned as pale as if he had met a ghost. He sat in silence a moment. Thereupon he said, "Abbot Hans has faithfully kept his word, and I shall also keep mine." And he ordered that a letter of ransom be drawn up for the wild robber, who was outlawed and had been forced to live in the forest ever since his youth. He handed the letter to the lay brother, who departed at once for the robber's cave. When he stepped in there on Christmas Day, the robber came toward him with axe uplifted. "I'd like to hack you monks into bits, as many as you are," said he. "It must be your fault that Göinge forest did not last night dress itself in Christmas bloom." "The fault is mine alone," said the lay brother, "and I will gladly die for it. But first I must deliver a message from Abbot Hans." And he drew forth the bishop's letter and told the man that he was free. "Hereafter you and your children shall play in the Christmas straw and celebrate your Christmas among people, just as Abbot Hans wished to have it," said he. Then Robber Father stood there, pale and speechless. But Robber Mother said in his name, "Abbot Hans has indeed kept his word, and Robber Father will keep his." When the robber and his wife left the cave, the lay brother moved in and lived all alone in the forest, in constant meditation and prayer that his hard-heartedness might be forgiven him. But Göinge forest never again celebrated the hour of our Saviour's birth, and of all its glory there lives today only the plant which Abbot Hans had plucked. It has been named Christmas Rose, and each year at Christmastide she sends forth from the earth her green stalks and white blossoms, as if she never could forget that she had once grown in the great Christmas garden at Göinge forest.